So, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here. This is actually my second time in Singapore. The first time was 3 years ago when I first took this picture at Garden by the Bay. And ever since I came here for the first time, I've been looking for excuses to come back. So I think presenting at iOS Conf Singapore is a pretty good one. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited today about speaking to you about the lessons that I've learned from becoming an SDK developer. So before that, a little bit about myself. My name is Oscar. You can find me on Twitter as @Swanros, or you can drop me an email anytime you want to talk about anything. Oscar@swanros.com, or you can just check my website, swanros.com, where I write about Swift, Elixir, and iOS in general from time to time. I work as an iOS software engineer with the PSPDFKit team, where we create a PDF framework for iOS, Android, and the web. Most of the work that I do on the SDK ends up in this little application that you can download from the App Store. It's a free application to manage PDFs. You can go to pdfviewer.io to get it. It's pretty cool, and if you have anything to do with PDFs on mobile, go check it out. So, I come from Colima. It's a really small city in Mexico. It's about 700,000 people in the whole state, and this is what it looks like. And fun fact is that it is literally on the opposite side of the world. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and show you what I mean by that. So there's Colima in Mexico, there's Mexico in America, and it's literally on the other side of the world. It took me about 35 hours to get here. So that's testament of, thank you. Yeah, that's just how much I wanted to be with you guys today. So thanks for being here. Another fun fact about Colima, we have one of the most active volcanoes in whole North America. This picture is from 2016. It won the third prize in the National Geographic's World Press Photo Contest in 2016, and you can follow the photographer if you like this kind of stuff. He posts pretty amazing photos every single day about the volcano. All right, so to what's next. A little bit of history. I've been working as an SDK developer for PSPDFKit for about a full year now. But before that, I spent about 2 years working remotely for a San Francisco startup, and I was doing macOS development. And even before that, I was working as a consultant, mainly doing work for startups and local companies. One thing I really like about being a consultant is that a part of apparently wanting to wear nice suits and point to computers with a pen, according to Google, is that you often end up working on things outside your comfort zone, things that you're not really familiar about. Because clients have all sorts of crazy ideas. You never know whether you're going to be working on the next game-defining game, or you're going to be working on the next big social platform. Things are always fresh when you're a consultant, and new challenges come all the time. One thing that I've noticed about consulting, though, is that everything is about optimizing. Clients often run with really tight schedules, so you need to invest your time wisely. Another thing that I have noticed in general about consulting is that even though the domain of the applications that you're going to be working on are pretty different, the core parts of those applications tend to be the same from time to time. One example of this is that a login system, for instance. Every application these days basically has a web component, so chances are that the application you're working on, will be working on in the future, will have to have some sort of way to let the server know who are you as a user, so he can serve the server can serve the right content for your instance. So this means that you'll need to implement the login mechanism, and you can implement it 1, 2, 3 times along your career. So even though we're seeing 3 different implementations of a login system right now, I think we can all agree that the core parts of building this are exactly the same. It's the exact same logic. It's the same component, just styled differently. This will not only happen with authentication, this can only happen with how you handle JSON, with how you handle the networking stack on your applications. Especially when you work by yourself, when you work on really small contained teams, you start noticing these patterns of how you approach problem solving. When you start recognizing these patterns, one common way of handling this is just to abstract those things from your application and create some components that you can just reuse as building blocks. These self-contained components are building blocks that then you use to create new applications from scratch. So you take these Legos, for instance, and you end up with an amazing creation, which is going to be your next application. When you take these components and start stacking them up, you can end up with a pretty you can end up with the bare bones of the new application quicker than if you just implemented every single thing every single time from scratch. So now, instead of lasting a couple days to get to a usable state of your application where you have your networking stack, your authentication stack, your data persistence stack down, you can just grab those and be done with them in a couple hours instead of a couple days. When I was preparing for this talk, Johnson Dell tweeted this, and I thought it was really on brand from the topic that I'm discussing. Here he's talking about how he's doing more granular frameworks to be able to reuse code that he reaches for quite often. You can see the patterns he recognized in how he works. He likes doing a login a certain way. He likes doing networking a certain way, data management his own way. How many of you can identify with this? How many of you have experienced this, what I'm talking about? So, I want to say that to everyone who raised their hands, congratulations, because that means you're basically already thinking like an SDK developer. So I want to give a round of applause to every one of you. What that means is that you recognize the value of packaging code to make it easy to reuse. And chances are, if that you're already doing this, is that you are reaching for one of the tools that we commonly use, like CocoaPods. Maybe you have your private pods that you can just import into your project, or have something that is enabled via cartridge or of the Swift Package Manager. However, in my experience, working as an SDK developer for a full year now, is that building an SDK involves much more than just tools. In my mind, the tools of how to be an SDK developer are the easy part of the equation, especially if the SDK you're working on, you're actually intending that to be put out there for other people to use. So what I'm going to outline now are the lessons that I've learned from becoming an SDK developer. And the lessons that I've learned are mainly contained in 3 categories. The first one is that empathy is your first line of defense as a developer. The second one is that you got to think about design. And the third one is that being patient pays off. Again. Yeah, okay, so let's talk about empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings for another. I think we can all agree on that. But when we're working as a developer, I think we could summarize empathy in 2 main points. Having empathy for your users is making sure you're not wasting their time. And another good point of being empathetic with your customers is that you need to help them get out of trouble before they even get into it. So you need to be one step ahead in all the decisions that you make. Yesterday, Misha talked about how applications have 2 kinds of interfaces, the one the user gets to see and the one the developers gets to see. When we're building an SDK, it's pretty important because both of those interfaces are exposed publicly, so you need to pay equal attention to both. So, I ask you one question. If someone is trying to use your product, whether it's an application or an SDK, why would you say they are doing it? Is it maybe because they are in a rush to get something done and they just want a tool to get the job done? Or maybe they are just, you are solving a problem that's super complicated and it's not really worth the investment for them to just roll their own solution? Or is it maybe a combination of both? What I think is that it all comes down to saving time. Your users only want to save time when they're reaching for your product. So, about saving time. The integration of your product, whether it's an application or an SDK, should be as easy as possible. So you need to avoid being a roadblock for your customers. You need to follow platform guides to make sure you are as idiomatic as possible. The learning curve needs to be as smooth as possible. So, for instance, if you're doing an iOS SDK and an Android SDK, the iOS SDK needs to feel at home with iOS. You need to use design patterns that iOS developers are used to. And another point that I want to make here is that you need to make sure that you don't overcomplicate stuff. You need to not get too clever. Be aware of that. Because when you're offering a solution to a problem, take into consideration that even though what you're proposing can be technically correct, if the solution is actually hard to grasp, it can end up being worse than actually a simple solution. So one thing that comes to mind right now is the operator overload in Swift. Like, it can get really messy if you don't take care of that. And I think we all experienced that before. So, about helping out. To me, documentation should be a first-class citizen of your SDK, as important as your code. It is an investment and it is not a waste of time. So tools like Yassi from Realm can help you get over with it really quickly because it just takes the documentation that you're already writing for your actual code and publish it as a beautiful website. Another point is that doing support is actually an opportunity for you as a developer to get better at what you do. So I want to talk about support a little bit. Support is often thought as a chore, but I found it to be a really humbling and eye-opening experience. To me, doing support is like having someone do code review to me, but 100 times better. Because the customer is only going to be looking at the final result of your API and it's going to draw assumptions out of it. Doing support is a great opportunity to make mistakes, to learn from your mistakes again. And it sensitizes you to the issues the other people are having in real life while trying to use your product. Doing support also implants a seed in your brain that will be there the next time you're trying to make a hard decision, whether it's designing a new UI or a new API. Because if you know that customers have found that pattern complicated in the past and they're reaching out to you for help, you know that that's maybe not the wisest choice to do right now. Okay, so let's talk about design. To us, design guides our users into the correct way of using their products. And when we talk about design, we can focus on two main areas. Talking design about UI, talking design about API, or talking design about architecture. However, I'm going to just focus on the first two, UI and API design. Again, I like to outline the differences between building an application and an SDK. When you download an application from the App Store, there's no way a binary can be modified by the user. It is what it is. When you get the application from the App Store, there's no turning back. There's really no dynamism as to what the user can experience with it. Sure, you can enable feature flags remotely, but the binary is done. Features are not shipped by mistake in your application. However, when you're dealing with an SDK, yeah, the SDK is also distributed as a binary. However, the SDK is a tool. The user, in this case, an engineer, as we are, can use this binary to match their needs. There's no guarantee what the SDK will be once it reaches the customer's hands. Two different users with the exact same issue and the exact same build of your framework can reach two completely different solutions out for them. And the reality about frameworks is that users will hold it wrong. So when I'm talking about design in terms of API, whether it's in terms of API or UI design, I like to ask myself two questions before even implementing anything. The first one, what will this UI or API design decision will imply? And the second one is it something that can fail? Implication. Implication is a strong word. It basically means that the user is going to be able to reach a conclusion based on the context that we provide for them. So for instance, if I show you this piece of code, the implication is that the component will perform something with a list of items. However, how would you feel as a user, as an engineer, if the reality of this piece of code is that component only picked the first item of that list or the last item of that list? The implication is that this will work, but you will feel betrayed because it's not actually true. The second one, for instance, we have another piece of code that its name fetch in background with a completion block. And this method naming kind of implies that this function is going to be executed in a background thread, but we are not actually sure and we need to trust that this is actually what it is doing. So there's an implication there that we need to take care of. And I think this became very apparent yesterday when Paul was talking about multi-screen application support on iOS. And someone in the audience was really struck by the API that Apple offers here. And there was a question that was asked in the Q&A section. How many screens can iOS support at the same time? And the reason, the answer is only really one because the iPad only has one USB-C port, right? But the API kind of implies that there's an infinite number of screens that we need to support. And even though if that's not true right now, we still need to kind of factor that fact into our design process and implementation decisions. So the lesson about this is that implications matter. Another example is this really ugly app. You can see that I'm sliding from the left here, right? And the implication is that, okay, I'm sliding from the left there's a menu to the left of the screen. And when I tap the button on the top, the implication is that something will happen from the top. But that's not what happens. When I tap on the menu button, the menu still slides from the left, so the implications are wrong. And I think this is actually how our users feel when the implications we set for them, or the implications we communicate, are not exactly what they are. So we gotta be careful about the design decisions that we make. So the next question is, in which scenarios won't this work? And to this, I like to distinguish between user errors and programmer errors. So the user errors are something that happens on the API. The user can resolve them with some way. So we need to just show that to the user and let the user figure out how to continue with the execution of our program. And the user has to say in what happens there. And there are programmer errors, which is something that the programmer is doing wrong. As I said before, programmers will hold the things wrong. And there are two categories there, so I'm going to explain. The user error, again, is maybe the user can fix it at runtime, so we offer that option to them. But we don't crash. We try to present an alternative or move forward. And it's obvious. The user errors need to be obvious and need to be reflected on the observable app state by the user. A programmer error happens when there's no way something will work, so we need to communicate that to the programmer. And we need to decide if it's fatal or we still can carry on. So for instance, auto layout, when you miscalculate something, when you create a wrong layout distribution, auto layout just throws a bunch of code into the console, and you can decide whether if it's worth for you to solve that or not, but the application will still mostly work. So in this case, AutoLayout is showing a big scary error message that hopefully the programmer will notice and fix it on time, or it will just crash. So we need to think like an engineer, meaning that you probably won't read the instructions. Okay, so patience is the third one. Patience is the capacity to accept or tolerate delayed problems or suffering without becoming annoyed or anxious. So as engineers, time is really valuable for us. As developers, at least in my experience, we tend to rush things. There seems to be a misconception in the industry that reaching a conclusion really fast means that you are a better developer. Any of you experienced this before? Like someone just thinks because they finish faster, they're better? So I think this belief is supported by company culture in a lot of cases, and I used to take pride in finishing things quickly, even though the solution was half-baked. So when I started gaining more experience as a developer, as an engineer, I started noticing that often the things that I rushed the most were the ones that caused the more problems in the future. So I started questioning myself about my strategy. So this feeling of doubt turned into something actionable. For me, when I had one of my first one-on-ones with my team lead in this company, so he had a list of items that he wanted to talk to me about, and pretty early on the list was this thing. He told me, you gotta stop and you gotta think more about what you're doing. And it was one of those things like, it just makes sense. Why I'm not investing more time in actually thinking about the solutions that I'm coming up with. The fact is that, in my experience again, rushing things ends up making your customers trust you less. People are using the SDK to solve problems. People are using your applications to solve problems they have. So if you rush something out the door, you're gambling with the trust that your customers have in you. And we can really fail them. Rushing something is just going to erode the trust the customers have in us, so be careful with that. We need to be really patient when dealing with our products and doing something that will potentially affect a large number of customers. About patience. So patience is unfortunately a virtue that does not come for free. You gotta actively work to make sure that you can afford to be patient. And things will go wrong. It's not always easy to stay calm when things go wrong. But if you have taken the time to invest time and effort to make sure that you can afford to be patient, when you need to rush stuff out the door, you can be more confident about the result because you invested in design and you invested in company culture. So in the end, it pays off and the net gain is positive. you can only afford to be patient if you're investing in empathy and design. So imagine if a customer is really pushing you on support because they need, because you messed up in your application or in your SDK, and they are having a critical issue that they need solved as soon as possible. If a user knows that you're empathetic towards their needs and their issues, even if they're not getting a response immediately, they'll trust you that you'll eventually have something for them, and they'll trust your gut. They'll trust that you will do the right thing. They're patient with you, so it goes both ways. And if you have invested in good designs, things will be easier to modify when you're in a rush. So please, I hope we can all make an effort to strip the industry out of this misconception that quicker is better. It's a toxic way of thinking about engineering, and ends up frustrating someone that's actually involved with dealing with complex problems as we are. Here are some tips to reach Zen. The first one is invest in a robust test suite. The second one, invest in a good documentation. Even if you know your product even if you know your product in and out, you never know when your brain will simply decide that it doesn't remember why you did something. So again, documentation should be as important as your code. Keep improving your work every single time you have an opportunity. There's this rule that leave the file better than you found it. I don't know if anyone has heard about it before, but this is a pretty good rule to make sure that you're always improving and always getting refreshing your mind about this stuff. And the last one, which is pretty important if you work on a team, make sure the information is accessible. If you're working on something that's tricky and make that information hard to find, when you're not around or someone on your team is not around that has all that information siloed in their head, it's going to be really difficult for someone else to pick up their work. So prefer a public channel of communication. So to recap, you need to be empathetic toward your users. Keeping in mind that if someone is using your product, whether it's an SDK or an app, you need to waste as little of your users' time as possible. Be as empathetic towards your users' needs and challenges as possible as you can. And this is especially true if you work on an SDK, because again, you never know how many customers that SDK is going to reach through your customers. API design should be as important, if not more, as UI design if you're working on an SDK. And if you're working in an application that you can say, oh, maybe this is not going to be open source anytime soon, maybe I don't want to strip this thing apart. Well, having a good separation of concerns is still a good way to ease your work once you need to rip something out to refactor it. So it's a good investment anyway. Patience is key, but to get there, you'll need to invest in supporting infrastructure that allows you to afford being patient. I think this is the ultimate goal of any organization, to be able to work on something tricky and interesting while at the same time having the opportunity to take the time to come up with solutions that are elegant and scale really well, instead of having a pile of hotfixes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the Pigeonhole.
All right. Okay. Based on your experience, which language is better for developing iOS SDK, Swift or Objective-C? What are the reasons? Okay, so this is interesting. We decide at PSPDFKit we still use Objective-C and Objective-C++ all the way down, because you really can't ship an iOS SDK if you're using Swift, because we still don't have ABI compatibility. And since we are closed source, we need to ship a binary, so that's not possible right now. So I would say that until Swift has ABI stability nailed down, Objective-C is the way to go. Okay, you might be patient as a developer, but how would you handle the user that is not patient for your app or SDK? Well, the thing is that you need to balance. You need to take care. I mean, you need to know your customer. You need to know how important is this, and you need to balance your priorities as a developer, as a product person, and what the customer is actually asking. So I think this is a case-for-case basis that you need to decide whether it's worth to invest something on to solve a specific person issues. If what they are asking don't quite align with what your plan is, then it's probably not a good idea to direct all the attention to that one. Okay. I've met some SDK developers who weren't prepared with enough documentation and always redirected me to their SDK sample projects when I got questions. What would you suggest to these people? I would suggest that you bump up the importance of documentation in your framework, in your project. So in my experience, when a customer asks a really simple question, that's often that's often a sign that something is not quite clear via the API implications or via the documentation that we have. So a sample project might be the right call there. But again, it depends in what area you are. It depends on what's your relationship with your customers. But I would say if you have a documentation, if you don't have documentation, investing that as a first line of defense is the best idea in my mind. And what's your greatest challenge working as an SDK developer at the moment? Interesting. One of the biggest challenges for me was actually getting familiar with the product. Fortunately, the company has invested a lot of effort into making sure that all these things that I've talked about are really nailed down. So it wasn't really difficult for me to get started. Much of that had to do with my own experience and my own expectations that before, this is one of the biggest projects that I've worked with. So when I first joined the company, I was used to be able to grab this stuff really quickly and to get started really quickly and just dive in and start solving stuff. But when you're working on a really big project, that becomes really difficult. And some of the things that we're doing are pretty complex. So what benefited me is that we have public documentation. So instead of asking on Slack, I could just Google our class name and our documentation would appear. So that's pretty useful. So that's what I would say, like not having documentation for something is probably the biggest challenge that you can face as a developer. Should we always push everything, anything in an SDK module? I guess that means like, should we have our application all separated into modules? I would follow the rule, don't over-engineer, don't actually do something until you feel like there's actually a need to do so. So, you know, we have talked about launch times before. So, yeah, if you think it's a pretty niche thing in your application, it's only one case where you're using that, then maybe it's not really worth it. One question. Is Swift Package Manager mature enough to be used for iOS SDK? I gotta be honest, I don't have much experience with Swift and the Swift Package Manager at all. But since it's a community effort, I would say that we can rely on it getting better every single time. But yeah, like Carthage and CocoaPod seems to be the default choice for many distributors of SDKs. So yeah, it's apparently pretty simple to get started distributing stuff via the Swift Package Manager. So yeah, I don't see why it would be such a hurdle to get it started. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you, Oscar.